The candles had barely been lit when the laughter began. Earl Julian Ashworth stood near the edge of the ballroom, his back straight, his jaw tight, as three young gentlemen whispered behind their gloved hands and did not bother to hide their smiles. He had heard the words before. Beggar Earl, ruined house, a title with no coin behind it. He had heard them so many times that they no longer cut as deep as they once did, but tonight, standing in the grandest ballroom in London, surrounded by chandeliers that cost more than his entire estate earned in a year, the words found a new edge. He had not wanted to come. His steward, Henry Colt, had practically forced him into his carriage, insisting that a man could not rebuild his name by hiding in the country. Society forgives, Henry had said. Society forgets. But Henry did not understand that society did neither. Society simply waited for a fresh scandal to replace the old one, and until that day came, Julian would remain the punchline of every drawing-room joke in London. He reached for a glass of wine from a passing servant and turned his back to the group of laughing men. He would not give them the satisfaction of a reaction. He had learned that lesson 3 years ago, when his father's name had been dragged through every newspaper in the city, when the debts had piled higher than anyone could explain, when the engagement he had once believed would save his family had been broken in a single, cold letter. He had learned to keep his face still. He had learned to let the words pass through him like wind through an empty house. Across the room, the crowd shifted, and for a moment, everything seemed to quiet. Lady Eleanor Whitmore had arrived. She moved through the ballroom the way a candle moves through a dark room, drawing every eye without asking for a single one of them. Her gown was the color of early morning sky, pale blue with threads of silver that caught the candlelight when she walked. Her hair was arranged in soft curls that framed a face already spoken of as the finest London had seen in a decade. Men who had ignored every other woman that evening suddenly found reasons to stand a little taller, to smile a little wider, to angle themselves toward the door she had just entered through. Julian had heard of her before this night. Everyone had. Lady Eleanor Whitmore, daughter of a respected but modest family, was the name on every mother's lips this season. The woman every eligible man hoped to court. The beauty that even other beauties spoke of with quiet envy. He had expected to feel nothing when he saw her. Beauty alone had never impressed him. He had grown up around women who used their faces as weapons, who smiled sweetly while calculating the worth of a man's estate behind their eyes. But when Eleanor Whitmore laughed at something her friend said, the sound reached him even across the crowded room, warm and unguarded, and Julian found himself watching her a moment longer than he intended. He looked away quickly, annoyed with himself. He had no business admiring anyone. A man in his position could not afford distractions, and certainly not one so far above his reach. Eleanor Whitmore, despite her family's modest means, was still the catch of the season. She would marry a duke, or at the very least a viscount with an unblemished name and a full treasury. She would never so much as glance twice at a man they called the beggar Earl. He was proven wrong within the hour. The three gentlemen who had mocked him earlier found him again near the refreshment table, emboldened now by drink and by the presence of an audience. One of them, a portly young baron named Percival Grant, raised his voice loud enough for half the room to hear. "Ashworth," Percival said, grinning at his companions before turning to Julian. "Tell me, is it true your father sold the family silver to pay his tailor? I heard the man arrived at his own funeral in borrowed shoes." The group around them laughed. Some tried to hide it politely behind their fans. Others did not bother. Julian felt the old, familiar heat rise in his chest. The urge to defend a father who could no longer defend himself. The urge to strike back with words sharp enough to silence the room. But he had learned, painfully, that anger only fed men like Percival Grant. It gave them exactly what they wanted. So instead, Julian simply set down his glass and met Percival's eyes with a calm that unsettled the younger man more than any insult could have. "My father's shoes are none of your concern, Grant," Julian said quietly. "Though I imagine your own tailor bills would make for far more interesting conversation, given the state of your last 3 waistcoats." A few surprised chuckles rippled through the group. Percival's face reddened, and he opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, a new voice cut cleanly through the tension. "I think the waistcoats are rather fine, actually." Every head turned. Lady Eleanor Whitmore stood a few feet away, her fan resting closed against her palm, her expression pleasant, but her eyes sharp as she studied Percival Grant. She had clearly heard everything. "Lady Eleanor," Percival stammered, his earlier confidence evaporating. "I did not see you there." "Evidently not," Eleanor replied smoothly. "Or you might have chosen a kinder topic for the evening." Cruelty is such an unattractive habit in a gentleman, don't you think? It ages one terribly. The group around them shifted uncomfortably. Percival mumbled something about needing air and excused himself, taking his companions with him, leaving Julian standing alone with the most celebrated woman of the season. For a moment, neither of them spoke. "You did not need to do that," Julian said finally, his voice guarded. He was unused to defense from strangers, unused to kindness that did not come with a hidden price. "I am aware," Eleanor said, tilting her head slightly as she studied him. "I did it anyway." "Why?" "Because it was cruel, and I do not care for cruelty, no matter who it is aimed at." She paused, and something softer entered her expression. "And because you did not flinch, most men in your position would have either fled or fought. You did neither. I found that rather interesting." Julian did not know how to respond to that. He was used to pity, used to scorn, used to careful avoidance from people who did not want to be associated with a ruined name. He was not used to interest, especially not from a woman who could have any man in the room with a single word. "Lady Eleanor Whitmore," he said instead, offering a small, formal bow. "I do not believe we have been properly introduced." "Julian Ashworth," she said, before he could finish, a small smile touching her lips. "Everyone knows who you are, my lord. That is rather the trouble, isn't it?" The honesty of the statement startled a short laugh out of him, the first genuine one he had allowed himself in weeks. "Yes," he admitted. "That is precisely the trouble." They spoke for only a few more minutes before Eleanor's mother appeared at her side, her smile polite but her eyes cool as they swept over Julian, taking in the cut of his coat, the absence of any jewels at his cuffs, the quiet signs of a man whose fortune had not yet recovered. Lady Whitmore did not need to say a word. Her expression alone made her opinion clear. "Eleanor, darling, Lord Carow has been asking after you," her mother said, her voice sweet as sugar and just as sharp beneath it. "Come, let us not keep him waiting." Eleanor hesitated, glancing back at Julian with an expression he could not quite read. "It was a pleasure, Lord Ashworth." "The pleasure was mine, Lady Eleanor." He watched her go, watched her mother steer her toward a tall, well-dressed man near the far end of the ballroom, a man Julian recognized instantly, Viscount Edmund Carow, wealthy, well-connected, and widely considered the most desirable bachelor of the season. A man with everything Julian no longer had. Julian told himself it did not matter. He told himself that whatever strange warmth had settled in his chest during those few minutes of conversation meant nothing, that it was simply the novelty of kindness after years of scorn, nothing more. He told himself that Lady Eleanor Whitmore would forget him by morning, that she would marry Carow or someone very like him, and that Julian would return to rebuilding his family's fortune in quiet obscurity, exactly as he had planned. But as he made his way toward the door, ready to leave the ballroom and its whispers behind, he found himself glancing back one final time. Eleanor was watching him too. Only for a moment, only until her mother's voice drew her attention away again, but it was enough for something small and unfamiliar to settle in Julian's chest, a feeling he had not allowed himself in years. Hope. He left the ballroom that night with his reputation exactly as damaged as it had been when he arrived, the whispers no quieter, the mockery no less sharp. Percival Grant would tell the story of his humiliation to anyone who would listen, twisting it until it favored himself again by morning. Julian knew this. He had seen it happen before, more times than he cared to count, but for the first time in 3 years, he found that he did not mind quite so much, because somewhere in that glittering, cruel ballroom, one person had looked past the whispers and seen something worth defending. And though Julian told himself firmly, again and again, during the long carriage ride home, that it changed nothing, that it could change nothing, a small and stubborn part of him could not stop thinking of pale blue silk and a laugh that had reached him across a crowded room. He did not yet know that this single evening, this one unexpected act of kindness from a woman he had no right to hope for, would become the first thread in a story that would unravel every carefully built wall around his heart, and challenge everything London believed about the ruined Earl and the season's most beautiful lady. Henry Colt was waiting up when Julian returned to the townhouse, a small fire still burning in the study despite the late hour. He took one look at his employer's face and set down the ledger he had been studying. "You look troubled, my lord," Henry said. "Was the evening so terrible?" "The evening was as expected," Julian said, removing his gloves and dropping into the chair across from the fire. "Grant and his friends found their entertainment. I gave them little to work with. And yet you do not look like a man who spent his evening being mocked." Julian said nothing for a long moment, staring into the flames. I met Lady Eleanor Whitmore. Henry's eyebrows rose. Everyone in London had heard the name this season, and everyone knew what such a meeting could and could not mean for a man in Julian's position. The Whitmore beauty, and what did she make of you? She defended me, Julian said, still faintly disbelieving of his own words. In front of half the ballroom, she silenced Grant with a single sentence and did not so much as blink. That is unusual, Henry admitted. Most young ladies would not risk their own standing for a stranger, however unjustly treated. I know, Julian rubbed a hand over his face, suddenly exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with the late hour. It means nothing, Henry. Her mother all but dragged her away to speak with Caro before the conversation had properly ended. She will marry well. She will forget my name by the end of the season, if she has not already. But even as he said the words, he did not fully believe them. And long after Henry had bid him good night and the fire had burned low, Julian remained in his chair, turning the evening over in his mind, unable to shake the memory of pale blue silk, a sharp tongue defending a stranger, and eyes that had looked at him not with pity, nor with scorn, but with something far more dangerous. Curiosity. 3 days after the ball, a letter arrived at Julian's townhouse that he did not expect. It was not from a creditor, nor from one of the few remaining friends who still bothered to write to him. The handwriting was elegant and unfamiliar, the seal pressed with a small flower he did not recognize. Julian broke it open at his desk, and his eyes moved quickly over the short, carefully worded lines. Lord Ashworth, the letter read, I find myself in need of counsel from someone who understands matters of business and finance better than the gentleman my mother insists on introducing me to. I have heard, despite what London says of you, that you possess a sharp mind for such things. If you would be willing to meet, I would be most grateful. Eleanor Whitmore. Julian read the letter 3 times before he set it down. He knew, of course, that this could not be as simple as it appeared. Young ladies of good families did not write privately to ruined earls asking for financial advice without a very good reason, and yet something about the directness of her words, the complete absence of flattery or pretense, convinced him that whatever her reason truly was, it was not a trap. He wrote back within the hour, agreeing to meet her the following afternoon at a small bookshop near Bond Street, a place respectable enough to avoid scandal, but quiet enough to avoid gossip. When Eleanor arrived the next day, accompanied only by her maid who remained discreetly near the door, she looked nothing like the radiant, effortless beauty of the ballroom. There were faint shadows beneath her eyes, and her hands, though gloved, moved with a restlessness that suggested worry rather than boredom. Thank you for coming, my lord, she said, keeping her voice low as they stood among the shelves of leather-bound books. You said you needed counsel, Julian replied, matching her quiet tone. I confess, I am curious what a lady of your fortune could possibly need advice on. Eleanor's expression flickered, and for a moment, the careful composure she wore so well, cracked just enough for him to glimpse something beneath it. My family's fortune is not what London believes it to be, she admitted quietly. My father made poor investments 2 years ago, in shipping ventures that failed. We have been living on the appearance of wealth ever since, borrowing against reputation rather than coin. If the truth becomes known before I am well married, my family will be ruined, and I will lose every prospect I have. Julian said nothing for a long moment, absorbing the weight of what she had just confessed to him. A man she barely knew, a man society considered ruined himself. Why tell me this? He asked finally. You could have chosen any number of advisors who would not risk your secret leaking through gossip. Because you understand ruin, Eleanor said simply. You have lived through it, and rebuilt yourself quietly, without begging for pity or hiding from it entirely. I have watched you these past days, Lord Ashworth, more than you likely realize. Your investments in the northern mills, the way you have slowly recovered your family's finances without a single soul in London noticing until it was too late for them to interfere. I need someone who knows how to do that, quietly. Carefully. Julian studied her for a long moment, surprised by how much she had apparently learned about his private affairs, matters he had gone to great lengths to keep hidden from prying eyes. You have done your research. I had to. I could not risk trusting the wrong person. There was something admirable in her caution, in the sharp, practical mind hiding beneath the beautiful face society only ever seemed to notice. Julian found himself reconsidering everything he had assumed about Lady Eleanor Whitmore in that single conversation. Very well, he said finally. I will help you, on one condition. This must remain entirely between us. If word spreads that I am advising you, it will only invite more scrutiny onto both our families, not less. Relief flooded Eleanor's face. Thank you, my lord. Truly, Julian, he said, surprising himself with the offer. If we are to conduct secret business together, we might as well dispense with formality. A small smile tugged at her lips. Eleanor, then. They began meeting once a week, always in careful, unremarkable places, a bookshop, a quiet corner of a public garden, once even a modest tea house, frequented mostly by merchants rather than nobility. Julian walked Eleanor through the basics of sound investment, explained which ventures had failed her father and why, and slowly helped her identify small, careful ways to protect what remained of her family's finances without drawing attention. At first, their conversations remained strictly practical. Numbers, ledgers, careful strategies whispered over cups of tea that grew cold as they talked. But as the weeks passed, the conversations began to drift into other territory. Eleanor confessed her frustration at being paraded before suitors like a prize horse at auction, expected to smile and charm while her family's secret desperation grew heavier by the day. Julian, in turn, found himself confessing things he had told no one, not even Henry. The crushing weight of watching his father's health decline under the strain of scandal, the broken engagement that had left him distrustful of nearly everyone who claimed to care for him, the loneliness of rebuilding a fortune with no one to share the small victories with. "You are not at all what London believes you to be," Eleanor told him one afternoon, as they sat in a quiet corner of a public garden, the autumn leaves scattering around their feet. "And what does London believe me to be?" Julian asked, though he already knew the answer. "A bitter, ruined man, hollowed out by scandal, incapable of feeling anything but resentment." Eleanor studied him carefully. "But you are not bitter, Julian. You are careful. There is a difference." He did not know how to respond to that, so he said nothing, simply watched her for a long moment, struck again by how easily she saw past the walls he had spent years building around himself. "You should be careful too," he said finally, his voice quieter now. "Being seen with me, even in secret, carries risk for you. If anyone discovers these meetings, your reputation could suffer as much as mine already has." "I am aware of the risk," Eleanor said. "I have decided it is worth taking." "Why?" She considered the question for a long moment before answering, her eyes fixed on the golden leaves drifting past them. "Because for the first time since this season began, I feel as though I am speaking to someone who sees me, rather than my face, or my dowry, or the connections my marriage might bring my family." "You do not flatter me, Julian. You argue with me when you believe I am wrong. It is rather refreshing." Julian felt something warm settle in his chest at her words, something he recognized with growing alarm as more than simple friendship. He reminded himself, firmly, that nothing could come of it. Eleanor needed to marry well to save her family. He had nothing left to offer a woman of her standing, not yet, not until his fortune had fully recovered, and even then, the scandal attached to his name might never fully fade. But reminding himself changed nothing. Each week, he found himself looking forward to their meetings with an eagerness he could not fully suppress, counting the days until he would see her again, memorizing small details about her that had nothing to do with business. The way she tucked a stray curl behind her ear when she was thinking, the small furrow that appeared between her brows when a ledger did not balance the way she expected, the sound of her genuine laugh, so different from the polite, practiced version she wore in ballrooms. Their secret continued through the autumn, growing into something neither of them had quite named yet, something both of them knew was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. Neither of them noticed, in those quiet weeks of stolen meetings and careful business, that they were being watched. Viscount Edmund Carow had grown suspicious of Eleanor's frequent absences, of the vague excuses her mother offered when he called and found her unavailable. He was not a man accustomed to being kept waiting, nor one who took kindly to the possibility that his intended prize might be slipping through his fingers toward a man he considered far beneath him. He began asking quiet questions of his own, and it would not be long before he found answers that would threaten to destroy everything Julian and Eleanor had carefully built between them. One evening, after Eleanor had gone home and the bookshop had closed its doors for the night, Julian remained behind, walking the quiet streets rather than calling for his carriage immediately. Henry found him there, near the corner of a lamplit square, and fell into step beside him without a word of greeting. "You have been in unusually good spirits these past weeks," Henry said eventually, his tone carefully neutral. "I confess, I did not expect that from a man still climbing out of ruin." "Business has been going well," Julian said, though the answer came a beat too quickly, and Henry's raised eyebrow told him the deflection had not worked. "Business," Henry repeated. "Is that what we are calling Lady Eleanor Whitmore now?" Julian stopped walking. "How did you know?" "My lord, you have hummed under your breath twice this week while reviewing ledgers. You have not hummed since before your father passed. A man does not develop such habits over improved shipping contracts alone. Julian let out a short, reluctant laugh, the tension in his shoulders easing slightly. It is not what you think, Henry. I am simply helping her manage a difficult situation with her family's finances, nothing more. And do you wish it were more? The question hung in the cold evening air, and Julian found he had no easy answer for it. He thought of Eleanor's laugh, of the sharp intelligence in her eyes when she caught an error in a merchant's contract before he did, of the quiet trust she had placed in him despite everything London whispered about his name. It does not matter what I wish, Julian said finally, resuming his walk. She must marry well, Henry. Her family's survival depends on it. I have nothing to offer a woman who needs a fortune. Not yet. Perhaps not for years. Fortunes can be rebuilt faster than you think, my lord. I have seen the Northern Mill contracts. Within a year, perhaps less, your name will carry weight again, scandal or no scandal. Julian said nothing, but the words settled into him, planting a small, stubborn seed of hope he had not allowed himself to entertain until that moment. Meanwhile, across the city, Eleanor faced pressures of her own. Her mother, Lady Whitmore, had grown increasingly insistent that she accept Viscount Caro's attentions, dropping careful hints over breakfast about the security such a match would bring, the relief it would offer their struggling household, the future it would guarantee for Eleanor's younger sisters, still too young for their own seasons. He has asked after you 3 times this week alone, her mother said one morning, stirring sugar into her tea with pointed emphasis. A man of his standing does not wait forever, Eleanor. You would do well to encourage him properly. I have been busy, mother, Eleanor said carefully, keeping her eyes on her plate. Busy, her mother repeated, her tone sharpening. Busy with what? Precisely. You disappear for hours at a time, and return with no explanation beyond vague mentions of errands and bookshops. I am not a foolish woman, Eleanor. I notice these things. Eleanor's heart pounded, but she kept her expression carefully neutral, a skill she had spent years perfecting in ballrooms far more dangerous than her own breakfast table. I have simply needed time to think, mother. The season has been exhausting. Her mother studied her for a long moment, clearly unconvinced, but let the matter drop, at least for the time being. Eleanor knew, however, that the reprieve would not last. Her mother's suspicion, combined with Caro's growing impatience, formed a dangerous combination that threatened to unravel everything before she was ready. That evening, at their next quiet meeting in the public garden, Eleanor confessed her mother's suspicions to Julian, watching his expression carefully for any sign of retreat. Perhaps we should stop meeting so often, she said reluctantly, though the words clearly pained her to speak. I do not wish to bring further scandal onto your name, not after everything you have already endured. Julian was quiet for a long moment, watching the last of the autumn leaves fall around them. Is that truly what you want, Eleanor, or is it merely what you believe you should want? She did not answer immediately, and in her silence, Julian found the answer he needed. We will be more careful, he said finally, but I will not abandon these meetings simply because society might disapprove. I have spent 3 years living beneath society's disapproval, Eleanor. I find I no longer fear it quite so much as I once did. Eleanor's expression softened, something warm and grateful passing across her features. You are a strange man, Julian Ashworth. So I have been told, he said, a small smile finally breaking through his usual guarded expression. Repeatedly, and often unkindly. She laughed then, the sound bright and unguarded in the quiet evening air, and for a moment, both of them allowed themselves to forget the dangers gathering around them, the suspicious mother, the impatient Viscount, the fragile secret they had built together in stolen hours and quiet corners of the city. But dangers gathering unnoticed rarely remained unnoticed for long, and neither Julian nor Eleanor yet understood how quickly their careful secret would begin to unravel. Viscount Caro found his answers on a cold morning in late autumn, and they arrived in the form of his own coachman, a man he paid well to notice things others might overlook. The Whitmore girl, the coachman said, standing before Caro in his study with his cap twisted nervously between his hands. She has been meeting a gentleman regular, my lord. Bookshops, gardens, once a tea-house near the docks. Always careful, always alone, save for her maid who waits outside. Which gentleman? Caro asked, though something cold and certain had already settled in his stomach. Earl Ashworth, my lord. Caro's hand tightened around the arm of his chair. For weeks, he had sensed something shifting, some subtle coolness in Eleanor's manner that had not been there at the start of the season. He had assumed it was simple nerves, the natural hesitance of a young woman facing a significant decision. He had not imagined she was secretly meeting with the one man in London whose name was more damaged than his own fortune could ever repair. "Are you certain?" Caro demanded. "Quite certain, my lord. I have watched them myself, more than once." Caro dismissed the coachman with a curt nod, then sat alone in his study for a long while, anger and wounded pride warring inside him. He had chosen Eleanor Whitmore carefully, not merely for her beauty, though that alone would have been reason enough, but for the connections her family name still carried despite their quiet financial troubles. Troubles Caro suspected but had not yet confirmed. He had intended to secure her hand before the season's end, adding her beauty and her family's remaining influence to his own considerable fortune. He had not intended to be made a fool of by a ruined earl with nothing left to his name but a crumbling title. He thought immediately of Gerald Finch, a man whose hatred for the Ashworth family ran deeper than Caro's own wounded pride. It had been Finch, years ago, who orchestrated the lies that destroyed Julian's father, spreading false rumors of gambling debts and fabricated evidence of financial mismanagement, until the elder Ashworth's name became synonymous with disgrace throughout London. Finch had done it out of pure jealousy, furious that the Ashworth family had once secured a business contract he desperately wanted for himself. The scandal had ruined the father's health along with his reputation, and though the old Earl had passed peacefully enough in the end, everyone who knew the truth understood that Finch's lies had hastened his decline. Caro called on Finch that same afternoon, finding the older man in his study surrounded by ledgers and correspondence, his sharp eyes lighting with interest the moment Caro explained the situation. "Ashworth and the Whitmore girl," Finch repeated slowly, a thin smile spreading across his face. How delightfully inconvenient for young Julian. I had heard whispers he was rebuilding his fortune quietly. I did not realize he was also rebuilding his reputation through secret courtship of the season's most celebrated beauty. "I want it stopped," Caro said bluntly, "before it goes any further. And I want the Ashworth name buried so thoroughly it never rises again," Finch replied, his smile turning cold. "It seems our interests align rather perfectly, Caro. Leave the matter to me." Together, they devised a plan designed to strike at the heart of everything Julian had spent 3 careful years rebuilding, timed to unfold publicly, cruelly, and with no possibility of quiet resolution. Unaware of the danger gathering against them, Julian and Eleanor continued their meetings through the following weeks, their conversations growing steadily more personal, the careful business discussions now merely an excuse for the time they spent together rather than the true purpose of their meetings. On a crisp afternoon in early winter, as they walked along a quiet path through the public garden, their steps slow and unhurried, Julian found himself speaking of things he had never intended to share with anyone. "My father was not a foolish man," he said quietly, watching his breath cloud in the cold air. "Everyone believes he gambled away our fortune, that he was weak and careless with money he did not understand how to manage. The truth is far different." Eleanor turned to look at him, her expression attentive and unguarded. "Tell me." Julian hesitated, old wounds resurfacing with a sharpness he had not expected. "There was a man, years ago, who wanted a contract my father had secured through honest negotiation and years of careful relationship building. When my father would not surrender the contract, this man began spreading lies. Falsified documents suggesting my father had accrued massive gambling debts. Forged letters implying financial mismanagement so severe it threatened the stability of businesses connected to our family. None of it was true, but by the time we understood what was happening, the damage had already spread too far to undo. Creditors who had trusted my father for decades suddenly demanded immediate payment. Business partners severed ties overnight. Society, always eager for a fresh scandal, believed every word without question. "That is monstrous," Eleanor said softly, her hand instinctively reaching for his arm. "Do you know who did this?" Julian's jaw tightened. "Gerald Finch. I have never been able to prove it conclusively, though I have my suspicions confirmed by more than one source over the years. He has covered his tracks carefully, and my father, may he rest peacefully, refused to spend his final years chasing proof rather than simply rebuilding what remained of our lives." "But you have not given up trying to find proof," Eleanor said, watching him carefully. "No," Julian admitted, "I have not, though I have grown more careful about how I search, and more patient about when I choose to act." Eleanor was quiet for a long moment, processing everything he had shared. "You carry this alone," she said finally. "The rebuilding, the search for proof, the constant weight of a name society has already condemned. Julian, you do not have to carry it entirely alone anymore." Something shifted in Julian's chest at her words, warm and dangerous, and entirely unfamiliar. He had spent 3 years convincing himself that he needed no one. That trust was a luxury he could no longer afford after his father's betrayal by men he had once called friends, after his own broken engagement to a woman who had abandoned him the moment his fortune crumbled. But standing in the quiet winter garden with Eleanor's hand still resting gently on his arm, he found himself wanting, desperately, to believe her. "Eleanor," he said quietly, turning to face her fully, "I must ask you something, and I need you to answer honestly." "Of course. These meetings between us, have they become something more than business to you? Because I confess, for me, they stopped being business weeks ago, and I do not know how much longer I can pretend otherwise." Eleanor's breath caught, her eyes searching his face with an intensity that made his heart pound against his ribs. "Julian, Before she could finish, the sound of approaching footsteps on the gravel path startled them both apart. Eleanor's maid appeared around the bend, her expression tight with worry. "My lady, we must go. Your mother has sent word. She is asking after you, and I fear she suspects something." Eleanor's face paled slightly, the moment between them shattered by the sudden intrusion of reality. "I must go," she said quickly, though her eyes remained locked with Julian's a moment longer than necessary. "Julian, I promise, we will finish this conversation soon." "I will hold you to that promise," he said softly, watching as she hurried away with her maid, disappearing down the garden path toward the waiting carriage. Julian remained behind for a long while after she had gone, his heart still pounding, the unfinished question hanging in the cold winter air between them like a promise neither of them had quite dared to complete. He did not yet know that Finch and Caro's plan had already begun to take shape, nor that the fragile happiness he had allowed himself to feel over the past weeks was about to be tested more severely than anything he had faced since his father's initial ruin. That evening, as Julian returned home lost in thought, Henry met him at the door with an expression more serious than usual. "My lord, a letter arrived for you this afternoon. I believe you should read it immediately." Julian broke the seal, and his stomach dropped as he read the contents. It was from an old business associate, warning him that Gerald Finch had been asking pointed questions about Julian's current investments, his relationship with the Whitmore family, and his standing among London's remaining creditors. The letter warned that Finch appeared to be gathering information for some larger purpose, though the associate could not say precisely what that purpose might be. Julian read the letter twice, his earlier warmth from the garden replaced by a familiar cold dread. Finch had remained quiet for 3 years, content to watch Julian struggle from a comfortable distance. This sudden renewed interest could mean only one thing. Finch had noticed Julian's growing closeness to Eleanor, and he intended to use it. "We must be more careful," Julian told Henry, folding the letter and tossing it into the fire, watching the paper curl and blacken until nothing remained but ash. "Far more careful than we have been." But even as he spoke the words, a heavy certainty settled over him, the sense that whatever storm Finch was preparing to unleash, it would arrive regardless of how carefully Julian and Eleanor tried to protect themselves. Some battles, he had learned bitterly from his father's ruin, could not be avoided through caution alone. They could only be survived or endured, or, if a man was fortunate and clever enough, eventually overcome. He only hoped that when the storm finally broke, it would not take Eleanor down with him. That night, sleep did not come easily. Julian sat in his study long after Henry had retired, staring at the small pile of documents he had gathered over the years, fragments of evidence too incomplete to prove anything conclusively against Gerald Finch. A letter here suggesting Finch had paid a clerk for false records, a conversation overheard by a sympathetic servant, never confirmed, never enough on its own to stand against a man of Finch's standing and resources. He thought of his father in those final months, growing thinner and more withdrawn as the scandal consumed everything he had built, insisting always that Julian let the matter rest, that chasing proof would only invite further ruin upon their already damaged name. Julian had honored that wish for 3 years, focusing instead on quiet rebuilding rather than open confrontation. But sitting there in the dim candlelight, the letter from his associate still fresh in his mind, he wondered whether that patience had finally run its course. If Finch intended to strike at Eleanor to reach Julian, then quiet patience was no longer a luxury he could afford. Across the city, Eleanor faced a similarly restless night. Her mother had questioned her extensively upon her return, though Eleanor had managed to deflect the worst of the suspicion with careful half-truths about visiting a friend recovering from illness. Her mother had not seemed entirely convinced, but had let the matter drop for the evening, too distracted by preparations for an upcoming dinner party to pursue the matter further that night. Alone in her bedroom, Eleanor sat before her window, watching the bare winter trees sway gently in the cold night air, replaying the unfinished conversation in the garden over and over in her mind. Julian's question still hung unanswered between them, and she knew, with a certainty that both thrilled and terrified her, exactly what her answer would be when she finally found the courage to give it. She had entered this season expecting nothing more than the exhausting routine of balls and suitors, expected to smile prettily, and choose whichever wealthy gentleman best secured her family's future. She had not expected to find herself drawn so completely to a man society had already discarded, a man whose quiet strength and careful honesty had shown her more genuine character in a few short weeks than she had glimpsed in Viscount Caro's polished charm across an entire season. But her family's situation remained precarious, and she understood, with painful clarity, that her feelings for Julian could not simply erase the very real financial dangers threatening her family's stability. If her father's failed investments became public knowledge before she secured an advantageous match, her younger sisters would face a season without prospects, without dowries, without the security every young woman deserved as she entered society. The weight of that responsibility pressed heavily on her chest as she finally climbed into bed, sleep coming slowly and reluctantly, filled with uneasy dreams of ballrooms and whispered scandal. The following days brought no immediate crisis, though the air around both Julian and Eleanor seemed to hum with quiet tension, the sense of a storm gathering just beyond the horizon, close enough to feel but not yet close enough to see clearly. Julian used the time to investigate quietly, calling on old business contacts who had once worked alongside his father, carefully steering conversations toward Gerald Finch without revealing his true purpose. Most offered little beyond vague confirmations of what Julian already suspected, that Finch was a man known for ruthless ambition, willing to bend truth and law alike whenever it served his interests. None could offer the concrete proof Julian truly needed. One contact, however, an elderly solicitor named Mr. Pratt who had once handled legal matters for Julian's father, offered a small but promising lead. There was a clerk, Pratt said, speaking carefully in the privacy of his cluttered office, who worked briefly for Finch during the time your father's troubles began. A young man named Peter Holt. He left Finch's employment rather suddenly, and rather mysteriously, not long after your father's scandal broke. I always wondered if there was a connection, though I never pursued the matter myself. I am an old man now, my lord, and such investigations require a younger set of legs than mine. Do you know where I might find this Peter Holt? Julian asked, his pulse quickening with the first real thread of hope he had felt in years. I do not, I am afraid. He left London entirely. If the rumors were true, somewhere in the north, I believe, though I could not say precisely where. It was not much, but it was more than Julian had possessed in 3 long years of quiet frustration. He thanked Mr. Pratt warmly, and left the solicitor's office with renewed determination, already forming plans to send discreet inquiries northward in search of the missing clerk. He did not share this new lead with Eleanor immediately, not wanting to raise her hopes before he had anything concrete to offer, but the discovery strengthened his resolve, reminding him that the truth, however deeply buried, was not necessarily lost forever. Meanwhile, Gerald Finch and Viscount Caro finalized the details of their plan over quiet dinners and carefully worded letters, choosing their moment with the same patient calculation Finch had once used to destroy Julian's father. They settled on an upcoming garden party, hosted by the Duchess of Marlowe, one of the final significant gatherings before the season's grand closing ball. It would be public enough to ensure maximum humiliation, yet intimate enough that Caro could orchestrate the confrontation exactly as he intended, forcing Eleanor into an impossible position before the very people whose opinions mattered most to her family's future. Neither Julian nor Eleanor suspected how quickly their fragile happiness would soon be tested, nor how completely the coming weeks would challenge everything they had begun to build together in quiet gardens and hidden bookshops, far from the watchful eyes of a society always eager for a fresh and delicious scandal. The Duchess of Marlowe's garden party was, by every account, the most anticipated event of the winter season, second only to the grand closing ball still weeks away. Guests arrived in their finest afternoon attire despite the lingering chill, wandering beneath heated pavilions strung with early winter greenery, sipping warm cider while musicians played softly near the frozen fountain. Eleanor arrived with her mother, dressed in deep green velvet that complemented her coloring beautifully, though her stomach churned with quiet unease she could not quite explain. She had not seen Julian in nearly a week, their usual meetings postponed due to her mother's increased watchfulness and his own mysterious business, which he had mentioned only briefly in a short note promising explanations soon. Viscount Caro found her within moments of her arrival, offering his arm with practiced charm that no longer stirred the polite interest it once had. "Lady Eleanor, you look radiant as always," he said smoothly, guiding her toward a group of guests near the heated pavilion. I confess, I have missed your company these past weeks. You have been rather difficult to find. I have been occupied with family matters, Eleanor replied carefully, keeping her tone light despite the wariness building beneath her calm exterior. Family matters, Caro repeated, something sharp flickering briefly beneath his pleasant expression. Of course, though I understand your family matters have taken you to some rather unusual locations recently. Bookshops, gardens, tea houses near the docks of all places. Eleanor's blood ran cold, though she forced herself to maintain her composed expression. I am not certain what you mean, my lord. Come now, Eleanor, Caro said, his voice dropping lower, losing its earlier warmth entirely. London is a small world, and secrets, however carefully guarded, rarely remain hidden forever, especially secrets involving a certain ruined Earl. Before Eleanor could formulate a response, Gerald Finch appeared at Caro's side, his expression carrying the satisfied smile of a predator closing in on wounded prey. Lady Eleanor, how wonderful to see you looking so well. I do hope your family's financial troubles have not caused you undue stress this season. The words landed like a physical blow. Eleanor's face drained of color as she realized, with sickening clarity, that Finch knew far more than he should about her family's carefully hidden secret. I do not know what you are referring to, she managed, her voice barely steady. No? Finch's smile widened. How curious. I have heard, from rather reliable sources, that your father's shipping investments failed rather catastrophically 2 years ago, and that your family has been quietly borrowing against reputation rather than actual wealth ever since. A rather precarious position for a family hoping to secure an advantageous marriage this season, wouldn't you agree? Eleanor's mind raced, searching desperately for some response that might salvage the situation, but before she could speak, Julian's voice cut through the tension, calm and controlled, despite the fury she could see simmering just beneath his composed exterior. That is quite enough, Finch. Julian had arrived at the edge of the gathering crowd, drawn by instinct and dread the moment he glimpsed Eleanor's pale, frightened expression from across the garden. Several nearby guests had begun to notice the tension, drifting closer with the particular hunger London society reserved for the earliest signs of fresh scandal. Ashworth, Caro said, turning to face Julian with poorly concealed satisfaction. How fitting that you should arrive precisely now. Perhaps you can explain to everyone gathered here exactly why a ruined Earl has been secretly courting Lady Eleanor Whitmore for weeks, all while hiding it from her family and from society entirely. Murmurs rippled through the growing crowd, curious guests abandoning their conversations to witness the unfolding confrontation. There has been no courtship hidden from anyone, Julian said, his voice steady, though his jaw remained tight with barely restrained anger. Lady Eleanor sought my counsel regarding certain business matters, nothing more. Business matters, Finch repeated, his tone dripping with false amusement. How convenient a phrase, and how thoroughly it fails to explain weeks of secret meetings in bookshops and public gardens. Tell me, Ashworth, is this perhaps a new strategy of yours? Having failed to rebuild your own fortune through honest means, have you decided instead to secure a wealthy match through calculated deception? The accusation landed exactly as Finch had intended, twisting Julian's careful rebuilding into something ugly and predatory before the very crowd whose good opinion mattered most. Julian felt the old, familiar heat of injustice rising in his chest, the desperate urge to defend himself against lies that bore no resemblance to truth. I have never sought Lady Eleanor's fortune, Julian said, his voice carrying clearly across the now silent garden. Her family's finances have nothing to do with my intentions toward her. Intentions, Caro said sharply, seizing on the word. So you admit to intentions then. Tell me, Ashworth, what exactly are your intentions toward a young lady whose family desperately needs the security only a proper marriage can provide? Because I assure you, a ruined title offers no such security. Eleanor watched the confrontation unfold with growing horror, understanding with painful clarity that whatever she said next would determine not only her own future, but potentially her family's survival as well. If she defended Julian openly, admitted the depth of her feelings before this crowd, she risked confirming every rumor Finch and Caro had orchestrated, exposing her family's financial troubles before she had secured any protection against the fallout. But if she remained silent, if she allowed Julian to stand alone against these vicious accusations without defense, she risked losing him entirely, risked confirming every doubt he had ever harbored about trusting anyone beyond his own careful walls. Eleanor, her mother said sharply, appearing suddenly at her side, her face pale with barely concealed panic. Say something. Tell them this is nonsense. that you have no association with this man beyond the most casual acquaintance." The crowd's attention shifted entirely to Eleanor now, dozens of eyes waiting expectantly for her response, waiting to determine whether the season's most celebrated beauty would defend a ruined Earl or abandon him to protect her own reputation. Eleanor opened her mouth, torn between the truth burning in her chest and the desperate need to protect her family from complete ruin, and in that terrible suspended moment of hesitation, something shifted in Julian's expression, a flicker of pain quickly masked by careful composure. "It seems," Julian said quietly, before Eleanor could find her voice, "that Lady Eleanor requires no defense on my behalf. I apologize for any inconvenience this misunderstanding has caused." He offered a stiff, formal bow to the gathered crowd, his eyes finding Eleanor's for one final, devastating moment before he turned and walked away, his back straight, his steps measured, giving nothing away to the crowd still watching hungrily for further scandal. "Julian, wait." Eleanor started, but her mother's firm grip on her arm held her in place, and by the time she managed to pull free, Julian had already disappeared through the garden gate, leaving nothing behind but whispered speculation and Eleanor's own crushing regret. The remainder of the party passed in a blur for Eleanor, her mother steering her through polite conversations she barely registered, Caro's triumphant satisfaction radiating from across the garden, Finch's cold, calculating smile following her every movement. She endured it all with practiced composure, though inside, she felt as though something essential had cracked and shattered beyond repair. That evening, alone in her bedroom, Eleanor finally allowed the tears she had held back all afternoon to fall freely, replaying the moment of her hesitation over and over, understanding with painful clarity that her silence had wounded Julian more deeply than any of Finch's calculated cruelty ever could have. She had spent weeks proving to him, in small, careful ways, that she saw him as more than his damaged reputation, that she valued his character over his circumstances, and in the one moment that had truly mattered, the one moment when her defense could have meant everything, she had hesitated, and that hesitation had cost her more than she yet fully understood. Miles away, in the quiet solitude of his study, Julian stared into the dying embers of his fire, Henry's careful attempts at comfort falling on deaf ears. He had told himself, repeatedly, that he had expected nothing less from a woman whose family's survival depended on a proper marriage, that her hesitation was simply practical wisdom, rather than any true reflection of her feelings. But the words offered little comfort against the raw, familiar ache of abandonment, the bitter confirmation of every doubt he had carried since his broken engagement years before. He had allowed himself to hope, however cautiously, that Eleanor was different, that her kindness and honesty reflected genuine character rather than temporary curiosity, destined to fade the moment real difficulty arose. Watching her hesitate before the crowd, watching her mother pull her away without a single word of defense, had shattered that hope more completely than Finch's cruelest accusations ever could. He resolved, sitting alone in the dying firelight, to end whatever fragile connection had grown between them, before it could wound him any further. Whatever he had begun to feel for Eleanor Whitmore, he told himself firmly, would have to be buried alongside every other hope he had learned, through hard and bitter experience, not to trust too deeply. Neither Julian nor Eleanor yet understood how quickly circumstances would force them back into each other's path, nor how completely the coming weeks would test whether the connection they had built was strong enough to survive the damage this single, devastating afternoon had caused. In the days that followed, London society feasted eagerly on the fresh scandal, embellishing the confrontation at the Duchess of Marlowe's garden party, until it bore only passing resemblance to what had actually occurred. Some claimed Julian had pursued Eleanor purely for her dowry, unaware that her family's fortune had already crumbled. Others insisted Eleanor had led the ruined Earl on cruelly, only to abandon him publicly the moment his intentions became too inconvenient to ignore. Neither version held much truth, but truth had never been society's primary concern. Eleanor's mother, terrified the scandal might expose their family's financial troubles before a suitable match could be secured, doubled her efforts to push Eleanor toward Viscount Caro, arranging dinners and outings with a desperation that left little room for refusal. "You must repair this damage, Eleanor," her mother insisted one evening, pacing anxiously before the drawing-room fire. "Caro remains willing to overlook this unfortunate business with Ashworth, provided you make your preference for him unmistakably clear before the season's closing ball. We cannot afford further scandal, not with your sister's futures depending on the security this match would provide." Eleanor sat rigidly on the settee, her hands folded tightly in her lap, saying nothing, though every word of protest burned unspoken in her throat. She understood the stakes perfectly well. She did not need her mother's anxious reminders to feel the crushing weight of responsibility pressing down upon her. But understanding the stakes did not make the thought of accepting Caro's hand any less unbearable, especially now, with Julian's wounded expression still haunting her thoughts every waking hour. She attempted, twice, to send word to him, brief notes explaining her hesitation, begging for the chance to properly explain herself. Both notes went unanswered. Henry, when she finally worked up the courage to call briefly at Julian's townhouse under the pretense of returning a borrowed book, informed her gently but firmly that his lordship was not receiving visitors at present. "He is not angry with you, my lady," Henry said quietly, clearly uncomfortable delivering the message. "I believe he simply needs time. These past weeks have reopened wounds he believed long healed. Please, be patient with him." Eleanor left Julian's townhouse that afternoon feeling more hopeless than she had in weeks, the borrowed book still clutched uselessly in her hands, her carefully composed explanation left unspoken and unheard. Meanwhile, Julian threw himself into work with an intensity that worried even Henry, spending long hours reviewing contracts and correspondence, pursuing the faint lead regarding the missing clerk, Peter Holt, with a single-minded focus that left little room for anything else. He told himself repeatedly that the work distracted him from thoughts of Eleanor, though in truth, every ledger he reviewed, every contract he negotiated, felt hollow and mechanical without the small satisfaction he had once found in sharing his progress with her during their quiet weekly meetings. Gerald Finch, meanwhile, grew increasingly confident that his plan had succeeded exactly as intended, the public confrontation having driven a clear wedge between Julian and Eleanor while simultaneously exposing enough doubt about the Whitmore family's finances to unsettle their standing without fully confirming the rumors. He began making quiet inquiries of his own, searching for any remaining threads that might allow him to finish what he had started years earlier, ensuring the Ashworth name never recovered its former standing. He did not yet know that his renewed interest in the matter, his careless questions asked among old business contacts, had not gone entirely unnoticed. Word of his inquiries drifted slowly back toward Julian through the same network of quiet contacts Julian had cultivated over years of careful rebuilding, and though Julian remained wounded and withdrawn in matters of the heart, his instincts regarding business and danger remained as sharp as ever. He began to suspect, correctly, that Finch's renewed interest signaled something larger than simple cruelty at the garden party. Finch was preparing for something more permanent, some final effort to ensure the Ashworth name remained buried forever. Julian resolved, despite his wounded pride and lingering hurt regarding Eleanor's silence, that he could not allow Finch's schemes to continue unchecked. Whatever pain the garden party confrontation had caused him personally, the danger Finch posed extended far beyond his own bruised heart, threatening not only his family's remaining reputation, but potentially Eleanor's family as well, should Finch decide to expose their financial troubles fully in his continued campaign of quiet destruction. The stage was set, though neither Julian nor Eleanor yet fully understood it, for a confrontation far more significant than the public humiliation at the Duchess of Marlowe's garden party, one that would force both of them to choose once and for all between caution and courage, between protecting themselves and fighting for something neither of them had expected to find this season. Peter Holt was found, at last, working as a modest bookkeeper in a small mill town 3 days' journey north of London, living under a name slightly altered from the one he had been born with. Julian's inquiries, patient and persistent over several weeks, finally traced the man through a distant cousin who still resided in London and reluctantly agreed, after considerable persuasion and a generous sum of money, to pass along a letter requesting a meeting. Julian traveled north himself, unwilling to trust such a delicate matter to intermediaries, arriving in the small town on a bitterly cold morning, with Henry at his side for support. Peter Holt proved to be a nervous, thin man in his middle years, clearly uncomfortable the moment Julian introduced himself and explained the purpose of his visit. "I wondered if someone would eventually come asking," Holt admitted, his hands trembling slightly as he poured tea in his modest sitting room. "I have carried this guilt for years, my lord. I did not know, when Mr. Finch first hired me, the true purpose behind the documents he asked me to prepare." "Tell me everything," Julian said quietly, leaning forward with barely contained urgency. Holt's story confirmed everything Julian had suspected for years, and more besides. Finch had indeed orchestrated the entire scandal against Julian's father, fabricating gambling debts through falsified ledgers Holt himself had been paid to create, forging letters implying financial mismanagement that never actually occurred. Finch's motive had been exactly what Julian suspected: jealous fury over a lucrative shipping contract Julian's father had secured through honest negotiation, a contract Finch had desperately wanted for himself and could not forgive losing. "I fled London shortly after the scandal broke," Holt continued, his voice heavy with old shame. "I could not bear watching an innocent family suffer for my own complicity, however unwitting I initially was. I have kept copies of the original documents, my lord, the true ledgers before Finch altered them for his purposes. I kept them hidden, uncertain what to do with such dangerous knowledge, fearing what Finch might do if he discovered I still possessed proof of his deception." Holt retrieved a small locked box from beneath his floorboards, and inside, Julian found exactly what he needed. Original financial records showing his father's accounts had been perfectly sound, alongside early drafts of the forged documents Finch had commissioned, complete with notes in Finch's own handwriting detailing exactly which figures needed alteration and by how much. It was, finally, after 3 long years of quiet suspicion and careful searching, undeniable proof of Finch's guilt. "Will you testify to this, if necessary?" Julian asked, his voice tight with barely controlled emotion. "Will you confirm, publicly, everything you have just told me?" Holt hesitated only briefly before nodding, his expression resolved despite the fear still evident in his trembling hands. "I owe your family that much, my lord, and more besides. I have lived with this guilt long enough. It is time the truth finally came to light, whatever consequences that might bring for me personally." Julian returned to London 3 days later with the proof carefully secured, his heart pounding with a complicated mixture of triumph and lingering grief for the years his father had suffered under Finch's lies, years that could never be fully returned to him now. But alongside that grief burned a fierce determination to finally clear his family's name, and, though he barely allowed himself to hope it, perhaps repair what had been damaged with Eleanor as well. He arrived home to find an urgent letter waiting, this one not from Eleanor, but from Henry's own network of contacts within London society. The letter warned that Eleanor's family situation had grown suddenly dire. Finch, apparently growing impatient with his campaign against Julian, had begun quietly spreading confirmed rumors of the Whitmore family's failed investments, rumors substantial enough that several of Eleanor's father's remaining creditors had begun demanding immediate payment, threatening to expose the family's true financial state publicly within days if their demands were not met. Julian's stomach twisted with dread. Whatever wounded pride still lingered from the garden party confrontation evaporated instantly beneath the urgent need to help Eleanor, regardless of what remained unresolved between them personally. Meanwhile, Eleanor faced the crisis her mother had long feared finally arriving in full force. Creditors called at their townhouse with increasing frequency, their polite requests growing sharper and more insistent with each passing day. Her father, already frail from years of quiet financial stress, had taken to his bed entirely, overwhelmed by the mounting pressure. Her mother alternated between desperate schemes to secure immediate funds and tearful recriminations aimed at everyone within earshot, including Eleanor herself. "If you had simply accepted Caro's attentions properly, none of this would be happening," her mother said one evening, her voice sharp with barely controlled panic. "He might have offered assistance, connections, anything to help resolve this crisis quietly. Instead, you allowed yourself to be distracted by a man who can offer us nothing but further scandal." Eleanor bit back the urge to defend Julian, understanding that her mother's fear, however unfairly directed, came from genuine desperation rather than deliberate cruelty. Instead, she retreated to her room, her mind racing through every possible solution, however unlikely, that might spare her family from complete ruin. It was during this desperate search that Eleanor made a discovery of her own. Searching through her father's neglected correspondence, hoping to find some overlooked solution or forgotten asset that might ease their immediate crisis, she instead found an old letter, tucked carelessly among unrelated papers, written years ago by a business associate of her father who had apparently once done work for Gerald Finch. The letter, written in a moment of careless indiscretion, referenced Finch's involvement in what the writer called the unfortunate Ashworth business, hinting strongly that Finch had orchestrated the scandal deliberately, rather than simply capitalizing on misfortune, as London society had always assumed. Eleanor's breath caught as she read the letter twice, understanding immediately its potential significance. If Finch had indeed fabricated the scandal against Julian's father, and if proof of that fabrication could be found and confirmed, it would not only clear Julian's family name entirely, but would also expose Finch's current campaign against her own family for exactly what it truly was: calculated cruelty rather than simple gossip. She dressed hastily and called for a carriage, determined to bring this discovery directly to Julian, despite the awkwardness still lingering between them since the garden party. Whatever pride or hurt feelings remained unresolved, this discovery was too important to delay. She arrived at Julian's townhouse just as his own carriage was pulling away, having just returned from his urgent journey north. Their eyes met across the busy street, both of them frozen for a moment by the unexpected coincidence. "Eleanor," Julian said, hurrying toward her as she climbed down from her own carriage. "I was just coming to find you. There is something urgent I must tell you." "And you," Eleanor replied breathlessly, clutching the old letter tightly in her gloved hand. "Julian, I believe I have found proof, or at least the beginning of proof, that Finch orchestrated your father's scandal deliberately." Julian's expression shifted from urgency to stunned disbelief. "I have proof already, Eleanor. I traveled north and found the clerk who prepared the forged documents. He has confirmed everything and possesses the original unaltered records to prove it conclusively." For a moment, both of them simply stared at each other, overwhelmed by the sudden convergence of their separate efforts, both driven by the same fierce determination to right a terrible wrong. "Then we have everything we need," Eleanor said, relief and excitement flooding through her voice. "Julian, this proof does not only clear your family's name. If we can show that Finch has a documented history of fabricating scandal for personal gain, it will completely undermine the rumors he has been spreading about my family as well." They stood together on the busy street, momentarily forgetting the awkwardness of their last encounter, united entirely by the shared urgency of their discovery. Julian studied Eleanor carefully, noting the exhaustion evident beneath her determined expression, the strain of recent weeks visible in ways her careful composure could not fully hide. "Eleanor," he said quietly, his earlier hurt finally giving way to something gentler, "about the garden party. I understand now, more than I did in that moment, the impossible position you faced. I should not have walked away so completely without giving you the chance to explain." "You had every right to feel wounded, Julian," Eleanor replied, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I hesitated when you needed me most, and I have regretted it every single day since. I was afraid of losing everything my family depended upon, of confirming rumors that would have destroyed us, regardless of what I chose to say. But my hesitation was wrong, and it hurt you unnecessarily, and I am truly, deeply sorry." Julian reached out, gently taking her hand, the old letter still clutched within it. "We will address the past properly, Eleanor, I promise you that. But right now, we have very little time. If Finch discovers we possess proof of his deception before we can act, he will destroy the evidence, or worse, escalate his campaign against your family before we have any chance to stop him." Together they hurried inside Julian's townhouse, where Henry greeted Eleanor with evident relief, immediately understanding the significance of her arrival alongside Julian's urgent news. The three of them spent the remainder of the afternoon carefully reviewing every piece of evidence, cross-referencing Holt's confirmed testimony against the old letter Eleanor had discovered, building a case so thoroughly documented that even Finch's considerable influence would struggle to dismiss it. "The season's closing ball is in 4 days, Henry observed, studying the calendar on Julian's desk. "Nearly all of London society will be present. If you intend to expose Finch publicly, my lord, there could be no more effective stage than that." Julian and Eleanor exchanged a determined glance, both of them understanding exactly what such a public confrontation would require, and exactly what it would risk should anything go wrong. "We will need to move carefully," Julian said finally, his voice steady with resolve. "Finch is dangerous when cornered, and Caro will certainly attempt to protect his own reputation once the truth begins to unravel. We must ensure our evidence is unassailable before we act, and we must choose our moment with absolute precision." "Then we have 4 days to prepare," Eleanor said, determination burning steadily in her eyes, despite the exhaustion of recent weeks. 4 days to finally end Finch's campaign of cruelty, and to reclaim everything he has stolen from both our families. Outside, the winter evening settled over London, cold and quiet, entirely unaware of the storm quietly gathering strength within Julian's modest townhouse, a storm that would finally break, 4 days later, before the very heart of London society itself. Over the following days, Julian and Eleanor worked together with a shared purpose that felt entirely different from the careful, secretive meetings of earlier months. There was no longer any need for pretense between them, no lingering formality to maintain. They sat together for long hours, sometimes joined by Henry, sometimes by Mr. Pratt, the elderly solicitor who agreed to review their evidence and confirm its legal soundness before they dared present it publicly. "This is remarkably thorough," Pratt admitted, studying the documents spread across Julian's desk with evident admiration. The original ledgers, cross-referenced against Holt's testimony and this letter Lady Eleanor discovered. I do not see how Finch could reasonably dispute any of this before witnesses, provided you present it with proper composure and clear organization. We intend to, Julian said firmly, though composure may prove difficult, given everything this man has cost my family. Difficult, but essential, Pratt cautioned. Finch is a clever man, my lord. If you appear driven by pure emotion rather than reasoned evidence, he may still find some way to twist the narrative in his favor, before witnesses eager for scandal regardless of truth. Present your case calmly, methodically, and let the evidence itself carry the weight of your accusation. Julian nodded, absorbing the advice carefully, though the effort required to remain calm while finally confronting the man who had destroyed his father's health and reputation would test every ounce of restraint he possessed. Eleanor, meanwhile, faced her own difficult preparations. She had not yet told her mother of the plan, uncertain how her mother would react to such a bold and risky public confrontation, especially one that would require Eleanor to publicly align herself with Julian before the very society whose opinion determined her family's survival. She finally worked up the courage 2 days before the closing ball, finding her mother alone in the drawing room, her expression drawn and exhausted from weeks of mounting financial pressure. "Mother, I must tell you something," Eleanor began carefully. "At the closing ball, I intend to help Julian expose Gerald Finch publicly. We have proof, definitive proof, that he fabricated the scandal against the Ashworth family years ago, and that he has been deliberately spreading false rumors about our own family's finances more recently, out of pure malice toward Julian." Her mother's face paled, alarm flickering across her tired features. "Eleanor, this is far too dangerous. If this confrontation fails, if Finch somehow discredits your evidence before witnesses, our family's ruin will be confirmed publicly and completely, with no chance of quiet recovery. And if we do nothing, Mother, Finch will continue destroying our reputation regardless," Eleanor countered, her voice steady despite her own fear. "He has already begun spreading confirmed rumors of Father's failed investments. Our creditors grow more insistent by the day. We are already facing ruin, Mother. This is our chance to expose the true villain behind our current crisis, and perhaps, if we succeed, to salvage something from this disaster rather than simply enduring it helplessly." Her mother was quiet for a long moment, studying her daughter with an expression Eleanor could not quite read, something between fear and reluctant admiration. "You have grown remarkably brave this season, Eleanor. I confess, I do not fully recognize the cautious girl who began this season so eager simply to please everyone around her." "I have had good reason to grow braver," Eleanor said softly, thinking of Julian's quiet strength, his patient honesty, the example he had set through years of dignified endurance, despite society's cruelest judgments. "Julian has shown me that dignity matters more than avoiding difficulty, Mother. I would rather face this confrontation honestly, whatever the outcome, than continue living beneath Finch's quiet cruelty indefinitely." Her mother reached out, taking Eleanor's hand with surprising gentleness. "Then I will support you, Eleanor, whatever you decide, though I confess, I hope fervently that your confidence in this plan proves justified." "As do I, Mother," Eleanor admitted quietly. "As do I." The remaining 2 days passed in a blur of careful preparation, Julian and Eleanor meeting daily now without any need for secrecy, reviewing their evidence repeatedly until every detail sat firmly organized in their minds, anticipating every possible objection Finch might raise, and preparing calm, measured responses for each. On the evening before the closing ball, Julian walked Eleanor to her waiting carriage after their final preparation session, the winter air sharp and cold around them, stars beginning to emerge overhead despite the city's persistent glow. "Whatever happens tomorrow," Julian said quietly, holding her hand a moment longer than strictly necessary, "I want you to know that these past months, despite everything that has gone wrong, have meant more to me than I properly know how to express. You saw past everything London believed about me, Eleanor, when very few others bothered to look closely enough to see the truth. And you showed me," Eleanor replied, her voice thick with emotion, "that character matters far more than circumstance, that dignity and honesty are worth protecting, even when the entire world seems determined to reward cruelty and deception instead. Whatever happens tomorrow, Julian, I do not regret a single moment of these past months, however difficult they have sometimes proven." They stood together a moment longer in the cold evening air, unspoken understanding passing between them, before Eleanor finally climbed into her waiting carriage, leaving Julian standing alone beneath the emerging stars, his heart steadier and more hopeful than it had felt in years, despite the significant uncertainty still awaiting them both at tomorrow's closing ball. The season's closing ball unfolded exactly as grand as London's finest tradition demanded. The Duke and Duchess of Marlowe's ballroom transformed into a glittering spectacle of candlelight and silver decoration. Every notable family in London gathered beneath crystal chandeliers to bid farewell to another season of courtship and calculated ambition. Eleanor arrived with her parents, her deep sapphire gown carefully chosen to project confidence rather than the desperate anxiety churning beneath her composed exterior. Her father, though still weakened by weeks of financial stress, had insisted on attending, determined to stand beside his daughter for whatever confrontation the evening might bring. Julian arrived separately, accompanied only by Henry, who carried the carefully organized evidence in a leather portfolio, ready to be presented the moment circumstances allowed. Julian's expression remained carefully composed, though Henry noted the slight tension in his shoulders, the controlled energy of a man preparing himself for battle, rather than simple celebration. They had agreed during their careful preparation to wait until the evening reached its natural social peak, when the largest possible audience would witness whatever unfolded, ensuring Finch would have no opportunity to quietly suppress the truth once it finally emerged. Viscount Caro spotted Eleanor early in the evening, approaching with his usual confident smile, apparently believing the garden party confrontation had successfully secured her eventual compliance. "Lady Eleanor, might I request the honor of this next dance? I believe we have important matters to discuss regarding our future together." "I fear our future holds rather different plans than you currently imagine, my lord," Eleanor replied evenly, though she accepted his hand for the dance regardless, understanding that maintaining appearances a while longer would serve their larger purpose. As they moved through the formal steps of the dance, Caro continued speaking, his tone carrying subtle threat beneath its polished courtesy. "I do hope you have reconsidered your unfortunate association with Ashworth, Eleanor. Your family's situation grows increasingly precarious, I understand. A proper marriage remains your family's best hope for weathering this current difficulty." "My family's difficulties," Eleanor said quietly, meeting his gaze steadily, "have been considerably worsened by deliberate cruelty rather than simple misfortune. Wouldn't you agree, my lord?" Something flickered uncertainly across Caro's expression, though he recovered quickly, forcing his confident smile back into place. "I am not certain what you mean." "You will understand shortly," Eleanor replied, offering nothing further as the dance concluded, leaving Caro visibly unsettled despite his best efforts to maintain composure. Across the ballroom, Julian located Gerald Finch near the refreshment tables, surrounded by his usual circle of admiring associates, clearly enjoying the satisfaction of watching his careful campaign against both the Ashworth and Whitmore families approach what he believed to be its triumphant conclusion. Julian approached deliberately, Henry following a few steps behind with the leather portfolio, and the surrounding conversation gradually quieted as guests noticed the tension radiating from Julian's carefully controlled expression. "Finch," Julian said, his voice carrying clearly enough to draw attention from nearby guests, though not yet loud enough to alarm the entire room. "I believe it is time we discussed my father's scandal properly, and your role in orchestrating it." Finch's confident smile faltered only slightly, quickly replaced by practiced amusement. "Ashworth, still chasing old grievances? I would have thought you had more pressing concerns this evening, given your rather public humiliation at the Duchess's garden party recently." "That humiliation," Julian said steadily, "was built entirely upon your lies, Finch, exactly as my father's ruin was built upon lies you fabricated years ago. I have proof now, definitive, undeniable proof." The surrounding conversation had fully quieted now, curious guests drifting closer, drawn by the unmistakable tension building between the two men. Word spread quickly through the crowded ballroom, and within minutes, a significant portion of London's assembled society had gathered to witness whatever confrontation was clearly unfolding. Eleanor arrived at Julian's side just as the crowd's attention fully solidified, her parents following close behind, her mother's expression tight with anxious tension, despite her earlier promise of support. "What proof could you possibly possess?" Finch demanded, though his confident smile had entirely disappeared now, replaced by something colder and more calculating. Julian nodded to Henry, who stepped forward and opened the leather portfolio, presenting the carefully organized evidence for all assembled to witness. "Peter Holt," Julian announced clearly, his voice carrying across the now silent ballroom. "A clerk you employed years ago, Finch, to fabricate false financial records against my father. He has confirmed everything, provided sworn testimony, and preserved the original, unaltered documents, proving my father's finances were entirely sound before you deliberately falsified them." Gasps rippled through the crowd as Julian presented the documents, allowing nearby guests to examine the clear evidence of forgery, the original ledgers standing in stark contrast to the falsified versions that had destroyed his father's reputation years earlier. "This is preposterous," Finch said, though his voice had lost much of its earlier confidence. "Fabricated evidence, clearly designed to distract from your own current improprieties." "Is it fabricated?" Eleanor interjected, stepping forward with the old letter she had discovered among her father's correspondence. "Because I have found additional confirmation, written years ago by one of your own former business associates, explicitly referencing your involvement in what he called the unfortunate Ashworth business." She held the letter up for the crowd to witness, her voice steady despite the significant risk she was taking, exposing her family's private correspondence before all of London society. "This same man, Mr. Finch, has more recently begun spreading deliberate falsehoods about my own family's finances, seeking to punish Lord Ashworth by destroying anyone he cares for. I believe that qualifies as rather compelling additional evidence of a pattern of calculated cruelty." The crowd's murmuring grew louder, shock and outrage spreading rapidly as guests began to fully absorb the implications of what they were witnessing. Viscount Caro, recognizing the catastrophic collapse of his carefully orchestrated plan, attempted to slip quietly toward the ballroom's edge, only to find his path blocked by curious guests eager to witness the unfolding scandal. "Caro was involved as well," Julian announced, his eyes finding the Viscount across the crowded room. "He discovered our private meetings and conspired with Finch to orchestrate the public humiliation at the Duchess's garden party, hoping to secure Lady Eleanor's hand through fear and manipulation rather than genuine affection." Caro's face flushed deep red as every eye in the ballroom turned toward him. His earlier confidence completely evaporated beneath the crushing weight of public exposure. He offered no defense, understanding instinctively that any attempt to protest would only confirm his guilt further, before witnesses already primed to believe the worst. The Duke of Marlow himself, drawn by the commotion, pushed through the crowd to examine the presented evidence personally, his expression growing increasingly grave as he studied the documents Julian and Eleanor had so carefully compiled. "This evidence appears remarkably thorough," the Duke announced finally, his voice carrying the weight of significant social authority. "Mr. Finch, I believe you owe Lord Ashworth's family a rather substantial apology, and considerably more besides, given the years of suffering your deception has caused." Finch, recognizing the complete collapse of his position before London's most influential witnesses, attempted one final, desperate gambit. "Even if this evidence proves accurate regarding events years past, it changes nothing regarding the current situation. The Whitmore family's finances remain precarious, regardless of who first exposed that unfortunate truth." "Perhaps," Eleanor's father said, stepping forward for the first time, his voice weakened by illness but steady with quiet dignity. "Our finances have indeed suffered difficulty these past 2 years. But difficulty born of poor investment is a common misfortune, faced by many families and survived through honest effort and time. Deliberate cruelty, orchestrated to destroy an innocent family's reputation and manipulate my daughter into an unwanted marriage, is an entirely different matter, and one I suspect London society will judge rather harshly, Mr. Finch." The crowd's murmured agreement confirmed her father's assessment, sympathy shifting visibly away from Finch and Caro toward the Whitmore and Ashworth families, whose dignified conduct throughout the confrontation had won considerably more admiration than their accusers' desperate attempts at deflection. Finch, recognizing the complete ruin of his social standing unfolding before him, offered no further defense, simply turning and pushing his way through the crowd toward the exit, his reputation shattered as thoroughly and publicly as he had once shattered Julian's father's reputation years earlier. Caro followed shortly after, equally disgraced, his hopes of securing Eleanor's hand, or indeed any advantageous marriage this season, entirely destroyed by his own calculated cruelty. The ballroom remained in stunned silence for a long moment after their departure, before conversation gradually resumed, now buzzing with astonished discussion of everything witnesses had just observed. Julian and Eleanor stood together amid the settling chaos, both of them slightly breathless from the intensity of the confrontation, relief and lingering adrenaline mixing powerfully within them. "We did it," Eleanor said softly, disbelief evident in her voice as the full weight of their success finally began settling over her. "Julian, we actually did it." "We did," Julian confirmed, his careful composure finally breaking into something warmer, more genuine than she had ever seen from him. "Together, Eleanor. This victory belongs entirely to both of us." The Duke of Marlow, observing their exchange with evident interest, cleared his throat pointedly. "Lord Ashworth, given everything just revealed regarding your father's unfortunate scandal, I believe it only proper that London society formally acknowledge the injustice done to your family. Consider your name fully restored, as far as my own influence can accomplish such things." Similar sentiments echoed throughout the ballroom as other prominent guests approached, offering apologies for years of unfair judgment, expressing admiration for the careful dignity Julian had maintained throughout his lengthy ordeal. Julian accepted these apologies graciously, though his attention remained fixed primarily on Eleanor, standing steadily beside him throughout the entire remarkable evening. As the ballroom gradually returned to something resembling normal celebration, musicians resuming their earlier melodies, guests slowly returning to dancing and conversation, Julian took Eleanor's hand and led her toward a quieter corner near the tall windows overlooking the Duke's winter gardens. "Eleanor," he said, his voice suddenly nervous despite everything they had just accomplished together, "I believe there is still an unfinished conversation between us, from that afternoon in the winter garden weeks ago." Eleanor's breath caught, understanding immediately what he meant. "You asked whether our meetings had become something more than business to me." "I did," Julian confirmed, his eyes steady on hers despite his evident nervousness. "And I never received your answer." "My answer," Eleanor said softly, stepping closer, "is that these meetings stopped being simple business for me long before that conversation, Julian. Perhaps from the very first evening you defended your father's honor rather than simply enduring Percival Grant's cruelty in silence. I have cared for you, deeply and genuinely, for far longer than I properly understood myself." Julian's expression softened completely, years of careful guardedness finally dissolving entirely beneath the warmth of her honest declaration. "Eleanor Whitmore, I have spent 3 years convinced that trust and genuine affection were luxuries I could no longer afford, that anyone claiming to care for me was simply waiting for the right moment to abandon me, exactly as others abandoned my father during his darkest hour. You have proven, through months of quiet kindness and remarkable courage, that such fears were entirely unfounded, at least where you are concerned." He reached into his coat pocket, producing a small velvet box he had carried with him throughout the entire evening, uncertain until this very moment whether circumstances would allow him the opportunity to use it. "I know this season has been extraordinarily difficult, filled with more scandal and danger than either of us anticipated when we first met. But I find myself entirely unwilling to face whatever comes next without you beside me, Eleanor. Will you do me the tremendous honor of becoming my wife?" Eleanor's eyes filled with joyful tears as she nodded, unable to form words adequate to match the overwhelming happiness flooding through her. "Yes, Julian. Yes, 1,000 times yes." He slipped the ring onto her finger, a modest but beautifully crafted piece that represented far more genuine sentiment than any extravagant jewel Caro might have offered, and pulled her into a gentle embrace, both of them laughing with relief and joy as the remarkable evening's tensions finally gave way to pure, uncomplicated happiness. Nearby guests, noticing the tender exchange, began murmuring with delighted interest, the news spreading rapidly through the ballroom that the season's most celebrated beauty had just accepted a proposal from the very Earl London had spent months mocking so cruelly. By the time the closing ball concluded that evening, the story of Julian Ashworth and Eleanor Whitmore's remarkable courtship, filled with scandal, danger, and ultimately triumphant vindication, had already become the most talked-about romance London had witnessed in years. Eleanor's parents embraced their future son-in-law warmly, genuine gratitude replacing their earlier anxious skepticism entirely, understanding fully now the remarkable character Julian possessed beneath society's unfair judgment. Henry, watching from a respectful distance, allowed himself a rare, satisfied smile, delighted to finally see his employer's long years of quiet suffering give way to genuine, well-deserved happiness. As Julian and Eleanor danced together beneath the ballroom's glittering chandeliers, London society watching with a mixture of astonishment and grudging admiration, both of them understood that whatever challenges still awaited them, rebuilding both their fortunes fully, navigating the continued gossip certain to follow such a dramatic public courtship, they would face every difficulty together, bound by a connection far stronger than any scandal or calculated cruelty had proven capable of destroying. The Earl everyone had once mocked so cruelly had indeed won the heart of the season's most beautiful lady, not through wealth or status, but through quiet dignity, genuine character, and a courage that had ultimately proven far more valuable than anything London society typically chose to celebrate. Their story, whispered and retold throughout drawing rooms for many seasons afterward, became a lasting reminder that true worth lay not in fortune or reputation, but in the steady, honest character revealed only when circumstances demanded genuine courage. In the weeks following the closing ball, London's opinion of Julian shifted with the same swift, thoughtless enthusiasm it had once reserved for mocking him. Invitations that had long ago stopped arriving at his townhouse now flooded his correspondence daily. Hostesses suddenly eager to claim the newly celebrated Earl and his remarkable betrothed as guests of honor at their gatherings. Julian accepted only a modest number of these invitations, still wary of a society that had shown him so clearly how quickly its favor could turn, though Eleanor gently encouraged him to allow himself, at least occasionally, to enjoy the vindication he had earned through years of quiet endurance. Gerald Finch's own fortunes collapsed rapidly in the aftermath of his exposure. Business partners severed their associations within days, unwilling to remain connected to a man now publicly proven to have fabricated evidence and orchestrated deliberate cruelty against two respected families. He retreated from London entirely before the month's end, his once considerable influence reduced to nothing more than a cautionary tale whispered among the very social circles he had once dominated so confidently. Viscount Caro fared little better, though his family's older, more established name spared him complete social ruin. He remained in London, but found himself quietly excluded from the most desirable gatherings, his reputation permanently tarnished by his willing participation in Finch's calculated scheme. Eleanor felt no satisfaction in his downfall, though she could not deny a measure of relief that his manipulative ambitions had ultimately failed so thoroughly. Peter Holt, whose courageous testimony had proven so instrumental in exposing the truth, received Julian's gratitude in the form of a generous sum of money and a heartfelt letter absolving him fully of any remaining guilt regarding his unwitting involvement in Finch's original deception years earlier. Holt wrote back gratefully, expressing relief at finally being free of the burden he had carried silently for so long. Eleanor's family's finances, though still requiring careful management, stabilized considerably once the false rumors Finch had spread were thoroughly discredited. Creditors, reassured by the public exposure of Finch's deliberate campaign against the family, agreed to more reasonable repayment terms, and Julian, now betrothed to Eleanor, quietly offered practical financial guidance that helped steady her father's remaining investments without any hint of scandal or impropriety. On a clear afternoon several weeks after their engagement, Julian and Eleanor walked together through the same public garden where they had shared so many of their earlier secretive meetings, though now they walked openly, arm in arm, with no need for caution or concealment. "It seems strange," Eleanor observed, glancing around at the familiar paths, "to walk here without watching constantly for prying eyes." "A welcome strangeness, I think," Julian replied, smiling warmly as he covered her hand with his own. "Though I confess, I have grown rather fond of this particular garden, regardless of the circumstances that first brought us here." "As have I," Eleanor agreed softly. "Perhaps we might return here often, once we are properly married. It seems only fitting, given everything this quiet place has meant to us." Julian paused, turning to face her fully, his expression tender in a way that would have seemed impossible to the guarded, wounded man he had been at the season's beginning. "Eleanor, whatever difficulties still lie ahead of us, rebuilding fully, navigating whatever residual gossip remains, I find myself entirely unafraid, for the first time in many years. You have given me something I believed I had lost forever, the simple courage to hope for genuine happiness, rather than merely enduring life's difficulties alone." "And you have given me the same courage, Julian," Eleanor replied, her eyes bright with quiet joy. "Whatever comes next, we shall face it together. Exactly as we faced Finch and Caro. Nothing London society could possibly offer frightens me now, not when I have you steadily beside me." They continued their walk through the winter garden, the earlier chill of the season beginning to soften into the first gentle promise of approaching spring, both of them fully aware that their story, though remarkable in its dramatic public conclusion, was truly only just beginning, a lifetime of partnership and genuine affection stretching hopefully ahead of them, built upon a foundation far sturdier than fortune or reputation could ever provide. Spring arrived early that year, or so it seemed to Eleanor, who found herself counting the weeks until her wedding with an eagerness she had never expected to feel toward any formal society occasion. The ceremony was set for late April, held at the same church where generations of Whitmores had married before her, though this time, for the first time in family memory, the match was built entirely upon genuine affection, rather than careful calculation of fortune and status. Preparations for the wedding brought their own small challenges, though nothing compared to the dangers Julian and Eleanor had already weathered together. Lady Whitmore, now fully reconciled to her daughter's choice, threw herself into planning with an enthusiasm that occasionally overwhelmed Eleanor, insisting on elaborate flower arrangements and an extensive guest list that seemed to grow longer with each passing week. "Mother, we do not need quite so many guests," Eleanor protested gently one afternoon, reviewing the latest addition to the invitation list with barely concealed exasperation. "Julian and I would be perfectly content with a modest ceremony among close family and friends." "Nonsense," her mother replied firmly, though her tone carried genuine warmth rather than her earlier anxious desperation. "After everything you have both endured this season, you deserve a celebration worthy of your remarkable story. Besides, half of London has already requested invitations. It would be rather unkind to disappoint so many well-wishers." Eleanor could not entirely argue with her mother's reasoning, understanding that their story had indeed captured London's imagination in ways neither she nor Julian had anticipated. Strangers approached her at social gatherings, eager to hear first-hand accounts of the dramatic confrontation at the closing ball. And though the attention occasionally felt overwhelming, Eleanor found herself grateful, on balance, that their story had ultimately become one of triumph and vindication, rather than continued scandal. Julian, meanwhile, focused his energy on completing the final stages of his family's financial recovery, determined to enter their marriage with his estate fully restored rather than merely improving. His northern mill investments, which had grown steadily throughout the autumn and winter, finally reached full profitability by early spring, allowing him to settle the last of his father's outstanding debts entirely. He visited his father's grave on a quiet morning shortly before the wedding, standing alone beside the modest headstone for a long while, finally able to share news he had waited years to deliver. "It is finished, Father," he said softly, the words carrying quietly across the peaceful churchyard. "Our name is restored. Finch has been exposed for the fraud he always was, and our family's honor stands fully vindicated before all of London. I only wish you had lived to see it." He paused, a small, genuine smile finally breaking through his contemplative expression. "I have also found someone remarkable, Father. Eleanor Whitmore, the finest woman I have ever known. I believe you would have approved of her completely. She possesses your same quiet strength, your same unwavering sense of honor, even when circumstances made honesty considerably more difficult than convenient silence would have been." He left fresh flowers at the grave before departing, carrying with him a sense of peaceful closure he had not felt in the 3 long years since his father's passing. The wedding day itself arrived bright and clear, unseasonably warm for late April, as though the weather itself had conspired to bless the joyful occasion. Eleanor dressed carefully with her mother and sisters assisting, the excitement in the household palpable despite the underlying nervousness natural to any bride on her wedding day. "You look radiant, darling," her mother said, adjusting the delicate veil with trembling hands, tears of genuine happiness gathering in her eyes. "I confess, when this season began, I never imagined it would conclude with such genuine joy. I am so very proud of you, Eleanor, and so grateful you found the courage to fight for what truly mattered, rather than settling for safety alone." "Thank you, Mother," Eleanor replied, embracing her gently despite the delicate arrangement of her gown. "Though I could not have found that courage without your support, once you understood what truly mattered to me." The ceremony itself passed in a joyful blur for Eleanor, the church filled with familiar faces, old friends and newly won admirers alike, all gathered to witness the culmination of a courtship that had captured London's imagination so completely. Julian waited at the altar as she walked down the aisle on her father's arm, his expression radiant with a happiness that transformed his once guarded features entirely, years of quiet suffering finally giving way to unguarded joy. Their vows were simple and heartfelt, spoken with quiet sincerity rather than elaborate flourish, each of them promising steady partnership and genuine devotion through whatever difficulties life might still present. When Julian finally kissed his bride before the assembled congregation, the church erupted in warm, genuine applause, a stark and welcome contrast to the mocking whispers that had once followed Julian through every ballroom in London. The wedding celebration that followed lasted well into the evening, music and laughter filling the Whitmore family's modest but elegantly decorated townhouse, guests dancing and celebrating with genuine warmth rather than the careful, calculating social maneuvering that typically characterized such gatherings. Henry, watching the celebration from a comfortable corner with evident satisfaction, finally allowed himself the rare luxury of relaxing entirely, his years of careful stewardship over Julian's difficult circumstances finally rewarded with the happiness he had always believed his employer deserved. As the celebration wound down and guests began departing into the warm spring evening, Julian found Eleanor near the quiet garden at the rear of her family's townhouse, watching the stars emerge overhead exactly as they had done that final evening before the closing ball, when everything between them still hung uncertain and unresolved. "Do you remember this garden?" Julian asked softly, coming to stand beside his new wife. "How could I forget?" Eleanor replied, smiling warmly as she leaned against him. "This is where you told me our shared efforts had meant more to you than you knew how to express, the evening before we finally confronted Finch and Caro together." "And now," Julian said, wrapping his arm gently around her, "we stand here again, married, our families' fortunes restored, our names fully vindicated before all of London. I confess, Eleanor, I could not have imagined, when I first arrived at that dreadful ball, mocked so cruelly by half the room, that this season would conclude so remarkably differently than I ever dared hope." "Nor could I have imagined," Eleanor admitted, "that the man everyone dismissed so unfairly would become the person I trusted more completely than anyone I had ever known. You taught me, Julian, that true character reveals itself most clearly not through wealth or status, but through how a person endures hardship with dignity and tact." They stood together quietly for a long while, watching the stars brighten overhead as the sounds of their wedding celebration gradually faded into the peaceful spring night, both of them fully aware that whatever challenges still awaited them in the years ahead, they would face every difficulty as genuine partners, bound by a connection forged through shared adversity and mutual respect rather than mere convenient circumstance. In the months that followed their marriage, Julian and Eleanor settled into their restored family estate, working together to rebuild not only their combined fortunes but also to establish a household defined by the same honesty and quiet dignity that had first drawn them together. Julian expanded his business interests further, eventually becoming known throughout London not merely as the Earl once mocked so cruelly, but as one of the city's most respected and trusted men of business, his careful, principled approach earning him partnerships that far exceeded anything his family had achieved even before his father's scandal. Eleanor, meanwhile, became known for her own remarkable character, using her restored social standing to quietly support other families facing similar financial hardship, remembering keenly the desperate anxiety her own family had endured before Julian's steady friendship and eventual love had helped guide them through crisis toward genuine security. Their story, retold throughout London society for many years afterward, became something of a local legend, whispered admiringly at subsequent seasons, whenever young debutantes worried that circumstance or reputation might prevent genuine happiness from finding them. The Earl everyone once mocked so cruelly had indeed won the heart of the season's most beautiful lady, not through fortune or flattery, but through patient integrity and quiet courage that had ultimately proven far stronger than any scandal London society could invent. And though the whispered mockery that once followed Julian through every ballroom had long since faded into distant memory, replaced entirely by genuine respect and admiration, both Julian and Eleanor understood, privately, that the true victory of their remarkable season had never truly been about restoring reputation or fortune at all. It had been about discovering, against every expectation society had placed upon them, a partnership built upon genuine trust, shared courage, and steady, unwavering devotion, a foundation far more valuable than anything either of them had originally sought when their unlikely story first began beneath the glittering chandeliers of a ballroom. Neither of them had expected to change their lives so completely. A year after their marriage, Eleanor gave birth to their first child, a daughter with her mother's warm eyes and, according to Henry, her father's same quiet, watchful patience. Julian held his daughter for the first time with a tenderness that surprised even himself, understanding fully, in that quiet moment, exactly how much his life had transformed since the lonely, guarded man who had once stood at the edge of a ballroom, enduring mockery with practiced indifference. Henry remained a trusted and valued presence in their household for many years afterward, eventually becoming godfather to their growing family, his steady loyalty during Julian's darkest years never forgotten nor taken for granted. He often remarked with quiet satisfaction that he had never doubted Julian's eventual happiness, even during the bleakest months following his father's scandal, though he freely admitted he had never anticipated quite how remarkable a woman would ultimately prove instrumental in achieving it. Eleanor's younger sisters, watching their elder sister's remarkable season unfold, entered their own eventual debuts with considerably more confidence than convention typically allowed, encouraged by Eleanor's example to value genuine character over calculated advantage when considering potential matches. Both sisters eventually found happy, loving marriages of their own, though neither courtship carried quite the dramatic public scandal that had characterized Eleanor and Julian's unforgettable season. Peter Holt, having settled his conscience fully through his crucial testimony, eventually returned to London at Julian's gentle encouragement, finding steady employment managing accounts for one of Julian's expanding business ventures, grateful for the chance to rebuild his own life after years of guilty exile. As the years passed, Julian and Eleanor's story remained a favorite among London storytellers, retold at gatherings and family dinners as an enduring example of how genuine character, patient courage, and steadfast loyalty could triumph over even the most calculated cruelty and unfair judgment. Young couples facing their own difficult circumstances often drew quiet encouragement from the tale, understanding that true partnership required far more than convenient fortune or fleeting social approval. Julian himself, when occasionally asked by curious acquaintances how he had managed to endure years of public mockery with such steady dignity, always offered the same simple answer, his eyes finding Eleanor's warmly across whatever room they happened to occupy. "I simply waited," he would say, "for someone willing to look beyond the whispers and see the truth underneath. When she finally arrived, everything else became considerably easier to bear." And Eleanor, hearing this same answer repeated countless times throughout their many happy years together, never tired of the quiet warmth that stirred within her, grateful beyond measure that she had found the courage, that fateful season, to defend a stranger's honor against cruel and thoughtless mockery, never imagining that single act of simple kindness would eventually lead her toward the most profound and lasting happiness of her entire life.